The rain came
Hey,
without
I
warning
know you're
that night,
tired,
the kind
but I
that
wanted to
turned
tell you
highway
I'm
lights
here.
into long bleeding streaks of
I'm
white
not leaving
and
your
red.
side.
Evelyn Carter gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles pale against the leather, her jaw set the way it always was at the end of a day that had ground on 12 hours past reasonable. The conference call had ended at 11:53. She remembered the exact time, because she had stared at the clock on her phone while the last of her vice presidents signed off without a single word of thanks. The deal was done. The numbers were clean. Everything was fine. That was all any of them had ever wanted from her, for the numbers to be clean. She merged onto the highway ramp and let the car climb to speed, and for a few minutes there was nothing except the percussion of rain against the roof and the low hum of the engine and the particular, private silence of being entirely alone. Her phone buzzed from the cup holder. She already knew who it was before she glanced down. Daniel. She hit the speaker button. His voice filled the car, low and even, the way it always was, never urgent, never demanding, just present. He said he had seen the late extension on her calendar and wanted to make sure she had eaten something before the drive. He said the rain was supposed to worsen after midnight and asked if she would consider stopping at the hotel 2 exits north. She said she was fine. He said he knew she was fine. He said he was just checking. She told him not to wait up and ended the call, and the silence came back immediately, heavier than before. She put both hands back on the wheel and watched the white lane markers vanish beneath the hood in an even, hypnotic rhythm. The truck came from nowhere, or rather, it had been there all along in the middle lane. Its hazard lights blinking faintly through the curtain of rain, and the driver made the decision to change lanes at precisely the wrong moment. The cab swung wide. Evelyn saw it and reacted. She did not brake hard. She steered. The wheel went left, then corrected. Then the right front corner of her car found the concrete median barrier with a sound like a single low note struck on something solid and final. The airbags did not deploy. The engine stayed running. The car came to rest at a shallow angle against the barrier, its hazard lights now blinking alongside the truck's 2 sets of orange pulses in the dark, as if the highway were sending a slow message no one was reading. She sat very still for a moment. Her chest was tight from the seatbelt. Her left ear rang faintly. She pressed both palms flat against her thighs and did a quiet inventory: neck, shoulders, hands, breathing, and determined that nothing was seriously wrong. She was reaching for her phone when a man in a reflective vest knocked on her window and told her not to move. In the ambulance, she lay on the narrow cot and listened to 2 emergency technicians talk across her body as though she were already furniture. One of them asked the other about Carter Industries' close that afternoon. The second said the quarterly projections looked aggressive. The first said he had opened a position last week. Neither of them asked her if she was in pain. A communications director from her own company reached by someone at the scene, and riding along for reasons she could not entirely work out, sat near the front of the cabin drafting a statement. She heard the phrase, controlled situation. She heard the phrase, minimal impact to operations. The rain hammered the roof of the ambulance, and she stared at the ceiling above her and felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with the seatbelt bruise. It was quieter than anger and older than loneliness. It was the specific exhaustion of realizing you have been misread for so long that you can no longer remember what it felt like to be understood. The emergency room was bright and cold. A doctor asked her to track a pen light and squeeze his fingers and tell him what day it was. She did all 3. He said the scans would take a few minutes, and then, in the space between one breath and the next, a thought arrived fully formed. If I close my eyes right now, who will actually be here when I open them? Not out of duty, not because their position requires it, but because they cannot bring themselves to leave. The question frightened her, which told her it was worth asking. She pulled the thin hospital blanket to her collarbone. She closed her eyes. And she waited. Evelyn Carter had grown up in a house where money was discussed in terms of its absence. Her mother worked 2 jobs and made both look ordinary. Her father left when Evelyn was 9, and the vocabulary of loss in their household was always practical: one fewer mouth to feed, one fewer reason to explain the electric bill to the landlord. She had not cried about it then, and had not cried about it since, because she had learned very early that emotion was a currency best hoarded rather than spent. She worked through high school with the focused patience of someone who already understood that the system would not simply open a door for her. She would have to build the door herself, hang it herself, and then present it so convincingly that everyone forgot she had arrived without one. She entered finance at 22, the only woman in a training cohort of 18, and spent the first 3 years being addressed by the wrong name in meetings, having her ideas credited to the man seated to her left, and smiling through all of it with a composure she later described to no one as the most exhausting performance of her life. She was not bitter about that period. It had taught her the exact distance required between herself and people who would use warmth against her, and she had maintained that distance with a structural precision that eventually looked, from the outside, like simple coldness. By 31, she had built Carter Industries from a boutique consulting firm into a mid-sized holding company. By the time the ambulance brought her through the sliding glass doors that rain-soaked night, it employed over 2,000 people, and her photograph had appeared on the covers of 7 national business publications, always with the same adjectives: formidable, uncompromising, visionary. None of them had ever used the word lonely, though it would have been the most accurate. Her senior leadership respected her the way one respects a weather system, because it is powerful and affects everything within its radius. A few feared her. 1 or 2 had tried, over the years, to get close in the calculated way that ambitious people get close to powerful ones, and she had recognized the pattern every time, with the tiredness of someone who has seen the same play performed by different casts for 15 years. She had no close friends. She had professional relationships of varying warmth, a dry cleaner who remembered she preferred extra starch, and a standing dinner reservation on the first Saturday of every month, where the staff knew to seat her away from the windows. She had asked herself once, on a long flight between cities, whether this constituted a life or simply a very efficient substitute for one. The exception, the single consistent exception, was Daniel. She had hired him 2 years earlier from a stack of 43 applications, and she had chosen him not because his credentials were the strongest, but because his cover letter was the only one that did not describe itself as passionate. He had written, with a plainness she found arresting, that he was a methodical person who valued precision, that he understood the work of a senior assistant was largely invisible, and that he found invisible work satisfying rather than thankless. She had brought him in for an interview and spent the first 20 minutes waiting for the performance to begin, the practiced enthusiasm, the calibrated deference, and it had never arrived. He was simply exactly what his letter described, and she had offered him the position the same day. He left a small dish of antacids on her desk after any meeting that ran past dinner. He memorized her medication schedule with quiet precision. Once, during a stretch, when she was running on 4 hours of sleep a night for 2 consecutive weeks, she arrived at 6:30 to find her 11 o'clock blocked with the single entry rest. She had called his extension to ask what he had done. He said he had moved the appointment and blocked the time in case she needed it, and that he could restore the schedule if she preferred. She told him to leave it. She sat in her office for 2 hours and did almost nothing. And it had been the first genuine rest she had allowed herself in months. She never mentioned it again, but she thought about it, in small sideways ways, more often than she ever admitted. And lying in the hospital bed with her eyes closed, she thought about it again, and wondered when exactly Daniel had become the person she most trusted in the world. Daniel Rowe had learned to carry things quietly. It was not a gift, it was an education, and the tuition had been steep. He was 38 years old, and had been a widower for 3 years, and in that time, he had developed a daily routine so ordered and deliberate that it sometimes looked, to people who did not know him well, like rigidity. It was not rigidity. It was the architecture of a man who understood that when 2 people depend entirely on you, improvisation is a luxury you cannot afford. He woke at 5:40 every morning. He made breakfast for his daughter, Emma, who was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of reading at the table. He walked her to the bus stop. He arrived at the Carter Industries building by 8:15. He worked until the work was done, usually between 7 and 9 in the evening, then came home, reheated whatever he had prepared the night before, helped Emma finish any remaining homework, and was asleep by 11. On Tuesday and Thursday evenings, he taught an online writing course for a continuing education platform, which supplemented his salary in a way that made the difference between manageable and comfortable. He did not complain about any of this. It was simply his life, and he respected it. His colleagues at Carter Industries were polite to him in the way people are polite to someone they have quietly decided not to take seriously. He was not aggressive enough to be threatening, not ambitious enough to be interesting, not connected enough to be useful. A few of the junior analysts referred to him as the shadow, meaning someone who followed the CEO without ever stepping into the light himself. He had heard this. He had not found it particularly wounding. He found it accurate in a way its speakers had not intended as a compliment, but which he chose to receive as one. He had taken the position because the salary was competitive and because, after his wife Margaret's death, he had needed work demanding enough to fill the hours that grief would otherwise claim. Margaret had been a project manager at an engineering firm, precise, funny, chronically overcommitted, and she had died of a cardiac event at 34 years old after a particularly brutal stretch of 80-hour weeks. The doctors had said there were underlying factors, other contributing elements, things that could not entirely be placed at the feet of overwork. Daniel had listened to this with the patience he brought to everything, and had privately disagreed, and that private disagreement had become the quiet engine of many decisions he had made since. He had not expected to find in Evelyn Carter anything more than a difficult employer, which would have been sufficient. What he found instead was something more complicated, a person who had constructed an exterior so professionally flawless that almost everyone stopped looking past it. Daniel had not stopped looking. He was good, constitutionally, at noticing the things people did not say. What Evelyn did not say, over 2 years of daily proximity, constituted an entire parallel narrative running beneath the one she presented to the world. She did not say that she ate lunch alone in her office because the executive dining room felt performative. She did not say that she always sent her driver home early because she preferred to sit in her own car, even if it meant an exhausted drive. She did not say that the photograph on her desk, a small, unframed print of a shoreline at low tide, was the only personal item in the entire office, and that she had moved it twice, each time a little closer to her direct line of sight. He noticed all of it. He adjusted things quietly, in ways designed to make the unspoken slightly less heavy. He blocked her calendar when she was running on empty. He left the antacids and the headache tablets, and once, an umbrella at the building entrance on a day when he had personally assessed the 30% forecast as closer to 80. She had taken it without a word. What his colleagues did not know, what no one knew, except one person in finance who had been explicitly asked not to discuss it, was that 2 years earlier, when Emma had needed a surgical procedure, and the remaining 40% after insurance had represented a sum that would have emptied his savings entirely, a payment had been made to the hospital from a private account, with no obvious connection to Evelyn Carter. He had asked about it and been told it was a billing correction. He had not entirely believed this, but had accepted it because the alternative that his employer had quietly paid a significant portion of his daughter's medical expenses and then arranged to make it untraceable was too large a kindness to fit comfortably into the professional relationship he thought they had. He filed it away and kept working, and kept watching over her the way one watches over someone who is brilliant and capable, and in real danger of forgetting that those qualities are not the same as being all right. When the emergency contact notification came through the night of the accident, he was in the hospital parking lot before he had consciously decided to go. The decision to keep her eyes closed was, in the beginning, almost clinical. Evelyn was a person who had built a career on information asymmetry, on knowing more than the other side knew she knew. Lying in a hospital bed with her eyes shut was, in its own strange way, simply another version of due diligence. She wanted to know who arrived, and in what order, and what they said, when they believed no one important was listening. The chief financial officer came with the general counsel. They spoke in the hallway just outside her room. The door had not fully latched, and sound traveled in hospitals with an intimacy architects never account for. The CFO wanted to know the protocol for temporary executive transfer of authority. The counsel said there was language in the bylaws for incapacitation of 30 days or more. The CFO asked about the definition of incapacitation. The council said the board would make that determination. The CFO said he thought they should brief the 3 largest institutional shareholders that evening, not tomorrow. She understood this was fiduciary responsibility. She did not hold the conversation against them with any passion. But she noted it. The head of marketing arrived sometime after and spent 11 minutes in the room before a nurse cleared everyone back. He had brought flowers, a large arrangement she suspected a hospital gift shop had assembled under fluorescent lights, and said, to no one in particular, that this was a terrible thing and that she would be fine because she was always fine. There was a quality to his certainty she recognized. The certainty of a person who cannot afford for you not to be fine, not because they love you, but because the alternative is administrative inconvenience. The night thickened. Visiting hours ended. One by one, the people from her professional life receded. She heard the senior vice president of operations on his phone, drafting 2 versions of the Monday board memo, one assuming full recovery, one assuming a longer timeline. She heard the word conservative 3 times in ways that had nothing to do with her health. She listened with the flat diagnostic attention of a scientist confirming a hypothesis she had already strongly suspected, and felt less than she expected to feel. And then Daniel arrived, and the quality of the room changed entirely. She heard him before she saw him, the quiet conversation he had with the nurse at the station about updated scan results. The nurse saying family only were authorized past visiting hours, Daniel saying he was not family but would appreciate being allowed to sit in the hallway nearby. The nurse, Emily, apparently finding something in his tone she recognized, said he could stay in the chair outside the door and offered to bring him a coffee. He said that was very kind, and he would take her up on that. And then she heard the chair outside shift as he sat down in it, and she heard him settle, and she heard him stay. She lay in the bed with her eyes closed and felt, for reasons she did not entirely understand yet, something in her chest loosened by one careful degree. The hours between midnight and 4 in the morning in a hospital are unlike any other hours. The building breathes differently, stripped of daytime's purposeful busyness into a place where real work happens without an audience. Evelyn had been awake through all of it, counting the intervals between footsteps in the corridor, maintaining the performance of unconsciousness with a discipline that, under other circumstances, she might have found darkly funny. She was good at stillness. It had never once been useful to her in any personal sense. Sometime around 1 in the morning, she heard the door open softly and then close. The chair beside her bed was drawn back, with a caution that seemed characteristic. Everything Daniel did was calibrated not to disturb, not to impose, and she heard him sit down. For a long time he was simply there. She could hear his breathing. She could smell, faintly, the cedar soap he used, which she had noticed once, when they were working late and close over the same set of documents. He did not speak. He did not scroll through his phone. He simply sat. He adjusted the blanket over her feet without being asked. He got up at some point and came back with something cool, a cloth, and with a gentleness that made her throat constrict in a way she was absolutely not prepared for. He laid it across her forehead. He tucked her hair back from her face. It was a gesture so ordinary and unguarded that she pressed her fingernails into her palms and breathed through it. He opened her email on his tablet. She had given him access, trusted him with it completely, and she heard him doing what she recognized as triage, reading and flagging and sorting, preparing for whatever morning would require, making sure that when she woke there would be one fewer mountain to climb back up. He was doing this at 1 in the morning, beside her hospital bed, on a night when everyone else had gone home. After a while the triage was done, and he was quiet again. And in that quiet, he began to speak. Not loudly. Not performatively. He spoke the way people speak in empty rooms, when the absence of an audience creates the conditions for honesty. He said he remembered the first week he had worked for her, when a client had come to the office and spoken to a junior analyst, a young woman barely 3 months with the company, in a way that was contemptible, and Evelyn had walked out of her office without announcement, addressed the client by name, and said with an absolute and terrifying evenness that his contract would need to be reviewed and that her office would be in touch, and then turned and walked back and closed the door. He said he had watched that and thought, she doesn't just run this company, she protects it. There was a distinction, he said. and not everyone in her position understood the difference. He said he had watched her work for 2 years and had never once seen her give herself the same consideration she gave everyone else. He said he had adjusted her calendar on 47 separate occasions to insert time for rest or food or basic human maintenance, and on 43 of those occasions, she had quietly restored the original appointments before the day was out. He had stopped being frustrated about it and had started simply adding the next one because the ratio was sustainable enough that she was, at minimum, occasionally sleeping. His voice was dry on this, not unkind the tone of someone who has decided that being rueful is more accurate than being hurt. He changed the cloth on her forehead. She heard the soft sound of water. He came back and smoothed it carefully in place. Then he said, more quietly, "She carries everything and puts it somewhere that doesn't show." And that is one of the most impressive things he had ever witnessed. And also the thing that worried him most. He was not sure she had ever been given, by anyone, permission to set something down. He paused. He said he was not sure she knew that was an option. He went quiet for a long time after that. And then the quality of his silence changed smaller, she thought. Or less careful. He said he had almost resigned in the spring. She felt her breath catch and managed, by an act of concentrated will, to keep her face still. He said he had written the letter and printed it and held it in his hands for 20 minutes before putting it back in the drawer, and the reason he had written it was that he had watched her cancel 4 consecutive personal appointments. A dentist, a doctor, 2 things she had scheduled under the heading personal time with no further annotation, and had done the math on her current pace and arrived at a conclusion that had frightened him. He said his wife Margaret had worked like that in her last year. He said the word frightened again, and this time it landed differently. He leaned forward in the chair. She felt the shift of his weight. He said his daughter Emma had seen a photograph of Evelyn at some point, a candid taken in a conference room where she was writing on a whiteboard and not looking at the camera, and had carried the photograph around for a week and informed him with considerable authority that this was a superhero, not a businesswoman, a superhero. He had not had the heart to complicate this assessment. He said Emma had asked about her several times since, and he had described her, somewhat inadequately, as someone who was very good at her job and very brave, and Emma had nodded with the authority of someone whose initial conclusion had been confirmed. He stopped. Then he said, "She is not wrong." Evelyn lay in the dark and felt a tear slide sideways across her temple and into her hair. And she let it go because there was no way to stop it that would not give her away, and because some part of her had decided quietly, without announcement, that it no longer needed to be stopped. He said he did not know why he was telling her this. He said possibly he had always assumed she would recover before he needed to figure out how to say any of it out loud, which was a kind of cowardice he was willing to own. He said he thought sometimes that the work he did was the only language he had ever been good at, and that this had been enough with most people. But that with her he found himself wishing, more often than was reasonable, that he were better at the other kind, the kind that did not involve calendar management or tablet triage at 1 in the morning. He went quiet for a long time. The rain outside had softened to a steady, even sound against the window, and when he spoke next, his voice was at its quietest. "Please come back." He said it without embellishment, without the hedge of professional distance. He said he was aware this was not something a person in his position said to the person in her position, and that she would almost certainly never hear it, but that it needed to exist in the air between them regardless, because some things needed to be said, even when no one was listening. He said, "Please come back, because there are people who need you in the world, not as a CEO, not as a quarterly earnings report. As a person, specifically, walking around and being difficult and drinking too much coffee, and occasionally making someone's day better without meaning to." He said, "Emma needs you to come back." He paused. He said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to come back." And then he covered his face with his hands. And she heard in the silence of the hospital room at 2 in the morning the sound of a man crying very quietly and without any self-pity at all, which was the most devastating and the most real thing she had heard in years. She held it for the rest of the night. She held every word, every pause, every shift of weight in the chair beside her. and she lay in the dark with the tears drying on her temple, and did not sleep and did not move. She had spent her entire adult life deferring immediate impulse for strategic outcome, and she understood, in the particular clear-eyed way that crises produce, that what had happened in that room was too real to be addressed with anything other than the total presence she had never quite given another person. At 6:47, when the early light came gray and quiet through the window, and the hospital had begun its gradual acceleration back into daytime, she opened her eyes. Daniel was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his chin on his chest, one hand still resting near the rail as though he had fallen asleep in the process of being nearby. He looked exactly like a person who had been awake too long and had finally lost the argument with his own exhaustion. She studied his face for a moment, with a directness she had never permitted herself, while he was conscious the dark smudges beneath his eyes, the specific set of his mouth when he was not managing anything, the slight furrow between his brows that suggested even in sleep he was somewhere doing something careful. She said, quietly, "You stayed the whole night." He came awake immediately, the way that parents of small children always do, no gradual surfacing. Just the instant shift from one state to the next. He stood up from the chair, and she watched him trying to compose something appropriate to the situation, and finding, apparently, that no such thing was available. She said, "Sit down." He sat. She said, "You look terrible." He said, and it came out before he seemed to decide to say it, "You look fine." And then he looked at the ceiling briefly. She thought this was the first time she had ever seen him fully embarrassed, and found it, to her own surprise, warm. The morning nurse came and went. A doctor arrived, performed a brief examination, and said she could likely be discharged that afternoon, pending one final scan. When the doctor left, she told Daniel to ask the nursing station to keep everyone else out until she called for them. He went to do this. She used the time to sit with the quiet of the room, and the question of what she intended to do, with the fact that she had spent the entire night pretending not to hear the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a decade. He came back and sat down, and she said, "You said you were thinking about resigning." In the spring, the quality of his stillness shifted. She had spent 2 years learning the minor gradations of his composure, and this one was new, not the stillness of competence, but the stillness of a person who has just realized how much trouble he is in. He said, "I said that out loud." She said, "You said quite a lot out loud." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him weighing what had been said against what could be walked back, and arriving at the conclusion that the math was not in his favor. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. He said, with a steadiness she thought cost him something, "I know what I said. I stand by it. All of it. I understand if that creates a problem." She said, "Emma thinks I'm a superhero." He said, "She is not wrong," exactly what he had said the night before, and she found this enormously comforting. In a way she could not have explained, she looked at the window. She said, "I heard everything. Everything you said last night, and everything before that. I wasn't unconscious. I was listening." There was a silence. She said, "I needed to know who was real." He did not say anything immediately, which was the correct response. After a moment he said, "And?" She said, "You are apparently the only one." He nodded once, as if receiving official confirmation of something he had already privately suspected. She said, "I'm sorry." He looked at her. She said, "For making you sit in that chair all night without telling you I was awake." He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I would have stayed either way." She believed him, completely, without reservation, which was not something she said of many people. She was discharged that afternoon. She did not go home. She went instead to a hotel for 2 days, the minimum time she felt she needed to reconstruct herself honestly rather than defensively, to decide who she would be when she walked back through the doors of the company she had built, now that she knew precisely what her company thought of her when no one was watching. She called Daniel from the hotel on the second morning. She said she needed his help thinking through a few personnel matters. He said he would bring his notes. She said, "Not work notes." He was quiet. She said she needed him to tell her honestly which of her people were actually good at their jobs versus simply good at appearing to be, and that she was asking him specifically because he was the only person in the building with nothing to gain from the answer. He thought about this and said he could do that. She said good. She said she would be back on Thursday. She said, also aware of the strangeness of what she was asking, that she hoped Emma was all right, and that she owed her an apology for inadvertently causing her father to miss bedtime. There was a pause. Daniel said Emma had informed him, with considerable authority, that Evelyn would be fine because superheroes always came back. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She said, "She's not wrong." The Saturday after she was discharged, Evelyn arrived at Daniel's apartment building at 11 in the morning with 2 paper bags, one containing the specific brand of good coffee she had once seen him look at longingly in a cafe near the office before putting it back because it was $9 for a small cup, the other containing 3 bakery items she had selected with more care than she would ever admit. She had driven herself. She had not told anyone where she was going. She stood outside for a moment before pressing the buzzer, which was unlike her. She was not a person who hesitated in doorways, but there was something about this particular door that was different from every other door she had walked through in her professional life. Every other door had been about what she could do. This one was about something she could not yet name clearly, but which felt, in its inarticulate newness, exactly like something worth being a little afraid of. She pressed the buzzer. The apartment was small and very clean, organized by someone who had thought carefully about how to make limited space feel like enough. There were books on nearly every flat surface, children's books, but also novels and a heavy reference volume on contract law. There was a drawing on the refrigerator door, held with 2 magnets. A figure in a red cape standing on something tall, rendered in the energetic style of a child who is more interested in emotion than anatomical accuracy. She looked at it for a long moment, taking in the crayon lines, the confident angles, the complete absence of self-doubt in every stroke. She did not say anything, but she felt it. Emma came around the corner and stopped and looked at Evelyn with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a child who has not yet learned to perform social grace. She said, "I knew you'd come back," Evelyn said. "Your father mentioned you thought I'd be fine." Emma said, "Superheroes always come back." Then she added, "As a matter of factual record. Also, you look smaller in real life." Evelyn said she had heard this before. Emma seemed satisfied, as though a minor administrative matter had been resolved, and went to help set out the bakery items without being asked. Daniel made coffee, and the 3 of them sat at the small kitchen table with the Saturday morning coming through the window in clean, unhurried slats of light. Evelyn found herself, by increments, doing something she had not done at a kitchen table since she was a child. She was simply present, not managing the room, not calculating downstream effects, not noting anything for the ledger she kept behind her eyes. Just present, with the coffee in her hands, and Emma reading aloud from a book she had brought to the table despite ostensible parental discouragement, and Daniel watching Evelyn with an expression she was just beginning to know how to read. At one point, Emma asked her, with genuine curiosity, what she did all day, and Evelyn found herself giving an answer that was actually honest rather than professional, and Emma listened to it with her chin in her hand, and then said that it sounded like a lot of managing people who should manage themselves, which was either remarkably perceptive or simply how it looked from 8 years old, and Evelyn suspected both were true. She stayed for 3 hours. When she stood to leave, Emma asked whether she could come back. Evelyn said she would like that, if her father didn't mind. Emma looked at Daniel with the expression of a child who already knows the answer. Daniel said, carefully, "She is always welcome." Evelyn nodded. She picked up her coat and got to the door, and stopped and looked back and said, to both of them, "Thank you, for the coffee and for all of it." Daniel said there was nothing to thank him for. She said, "There is. Quite a lot. Actually." She sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine. Someone 2 buildings down was walking a very old dog with great patience. A child somewhere was running. audible without being visible. She looked at the building and felt, with a clarity that was not dramatic but was complete, that she had been very lucky. Not because the accident had been minor, not because the night in the hospital could not have gone worse, but because she had been in the right kind of trouble at the right time to find out, with absolute certainty, what mattered. Most people went their entire lives managing not to find out. The following Tuesday, Evelyn walked back into Carter Industries, the way she always had, early, direct, unhurried, but with one difference that several people noticed and were unable to articulate. She looked like someone who had decided something fundamental. There is a specific quality to a person who has stopped performing composure and begun simply having it, and it read. To the people in that building, as something between intimidating and very slightly alarming. By the end of the week, 3 senior executives had been given the option to resign with severance packages their lawyers would find generous, and all 3, reading the room with the accuracy that had presumably gotten them to senior positions in the first place, chose to take the offer. The investor relations director, who had cried in the hospital hallway, was given an expanded mandate and a budget to match. The communications director, who had drafted the statement in the ambulance, was moved to a position with a more appropriate title and considerably less proximity to Evelyn's schedule. She restructured the executive meeting rhythm. She ended the default practice of scheduling anything past 9 in the evening. She created a mandatory rest period for any team that had worked more than 60 hours in a given week, which prompted a flurry of anxious internal memos about productivity that she addressed with a single company-wide note. A company whose people are depleted is not running efficiently, it is running on borrowed time. She had seen what running on borrowed time looked like. She had been shown, in precise and personal detail, exactly what the bill looked like when it came due. She was not interested in paying it again. She called Daniel into her office on a Friday afternoon. She said she was restructuring his role. She said she wanted to expand it, that she needed someone who could function less as a task manager and more as a genuine thought partner, someone she could trust to tell her when she was wrong before the consequences arrived. And that she believed he was that person. He said he was not sure he was qualified for the expanded description. She said, with the directness that had always been her most reliable instrument, "I have been watching you work for 2 years. I am certain you are." He said he would need to think about it. She said, "Of course." She did not tell him that the fact that he wanted to think about it, rather than accepting immediately, as a calculated person would, was itself a large part of why she trusted him. He came back on Monday and said yes. In the months that followed, Evelyn Carter changed at the speed that real change moves, not dramatic, but genuinely irreversible. She started eating lunch outside her office. She kept the photograph of the shoreline on the windowsill, where it caught the afternoon light. She kept the standing Saturday reservation, but more and more often canceled it in favor of a different kind of dinner. At a small kitchen table on a residential street, where the trees had leafed out fully, where a child who had already determined her character rating set the table without being asked, and where the cooking was done by a person who found invisible work satisfying rather than thankless, and who was, it turned out, an unexpectedly good cook. Emma asked her once, over dinner in early autumn, whether she missed her big apartment. Evelyn considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions that deserved a real answer. She said she did not miss it particularly. Emma asked what she missed. Evelyn thought about it. She said she had not realized, for a long time, that she was missing anything. She had been too busy. Emma nodded with the gravity of someone taking a note. Daniel, at the stove, made no comment, but she saw his shoulders change. One evening in October, Evelyn arrived later than usual. A meeting had run, and then another, and the apartment was already in its evening register. Emma asleep, the kitchen clean, the lamp in the corner on. Daniel reading at the table with his glasses on, which was something she had not seen before, and which struck her as unexpectedly intimate. He looked up when she came in. She said she was sorry for being late. He said she was not required to apologize. She said, "I know." She said it anyway. She sat down at the table across from him. He put the book down. The apartment was very quiet. She looked at the drawing on the refrigerator still there. Still the red-caped figure on something tall, and then she looked back at him and said, "I want to ask you something." He said, "Go ahead." She said she was aware that what had happened between them had happened in a particular and unusual sequence, and that she had not yet said plainly what she should have said some time ago. He waited. She said, "I am grateful for the night you stayed. I am grateful for every adjustment you made to a calendar before I was awake enough to stop you. I am grateful for the umbrella on the day it was going to rain. And I am grateful," she paused. The pause of someone choosing accuracy over comfort, "that you did not resign in the spring." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm glad I didn't." She said, "I know." He said, in the economy of language that was his most honest register, "You should know that Emma has been lobbying for a more formalized arrangement for approximately 3 months. Evelyn said she was aware, having been a direct participant in most of those efforts." He said, "I want to be clear that I am not asking for anything you are not prepared to give freely." She said, "I know that too," and then she looked at him across the table, with the lamp making everything warm and the October rain beginning against the window, and said, "I think I am prepared to give quite a lot, actually." He looked at her. He said, "Me too." They sat for a while longer at the kitchen table, while the rain deepened outside. And at some point the conversation shifted to Emma, to the company, to a book he was reading that she had not heard of but found herself wanting to read now, to a problem she had been turning over for days that resolved itself, as problems often do, in the process of being talked about by two people who trusted each other completely. There was no agenda. There was no outcome to be managed. There was simply the lamp making a small circle of light around the table, and the rain, and the specific quiet that belongs to a room where people are comfortable enough with each other to let a silence simply be a silence, rather than a gap to be filled. She had forgotten, or perhaps had never properly known what that felt like. It felt, she thought, like something she had been working toward for a very long time without knowing what it was called. The drawing on the refrigerator was the last thing she saw before she left that night. The red-caped figure, the crayon lines drawn with absolute confidence by someone who had decided, on the basis of one blurry press photograph, exactly who Evelyn Carter was and had never once revised the assessment. She stood on the street afterward in the light rain and looked up at the lit window of the apartment he had stayed up to see her safely to her car, which she knew without needing to verify, in the same way she had come to know many small things about him that he never announced, and she thought about the night on the highway, the rain, the barrier, the ambulance, the performance she had mounted in a hospital bed while the world moved around her on its customary axis. She thought about what she had been looking for, lying in that room with her eyes closed. She thought about what she had found. Not what she had expected. Something better than what she had expected. Not a discovery she could have planned for. Not an outcome she could have optimized toward. But the specific, irreplaceable warmth of a person who chose to stay not because it was required, or professionally correct or advantageous to him in any measurable way, but simply because leaving was not something he was capable of. The taxi came around the corner, its lights making long reflections on the wet street. She pulled her coat closed. She looked at the window one more time, the small square of light in the dark October street, steady and warm against the rain, and felt, with a completeness she had not known she was capable of, that she had arrived somewhere, not a destination she had mapped or planned or strategically pursued. Somewhere better. A place she had been led to by an accident on a rainy highway, and a chair beside a hospital bed, and a man who had told the truth into what he believed was an empty room, and a child who had known, with the unshakable confidence of someone who has not yet been taught to doubt her own instincts, that the person in that hospital bed was going to be fine. Not because everything always worked out, but because some people were worth coming back for, and some people, if you were very lucky and very honest with yourself at exactly the right moment, turned out to be worth coming back to. The accident that night had not cost her anything.